Okay. She don't even call people back no more. Hey.
She doesn't know us. You don't know us anymore.
Oh, okay. I got to put the internet.
No, she like it.
You're like,
Dried up looking things now. I made lamb chops yesterday, and the glaze was made out of raisins and fruits. Glaze.
That was in my entry. Whatever.
Ready to go. Everybody ready?
yes, I'm ready.
Let's roll.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call this committee meeting of the Economic Development and Neighborhood Business Development, and we're going to discuss the housing strategy. And I'm joined here by Councilors Williams, Jones-Rouser, Caldwell, Monto, and Nave. And I'd like to recognize we have former City Councilor Latoya Allen in the chambers. It's nice seeing you again, Councilor. Yeah. Can we have that? It's lucky it's recorded. Nobody ever says that. I'm going to hand it over to Commissioner Skabansky and Mr. Buki, and we'll go from there. You got a slideshow for us, right?
Good morning, everyone. Michelle Stepanski, Deputy Commissioner of Neighborhood Development. So we've got the team here from CZB back with us to talk about the housing strategy. This is now the third time that the CZB folks have been presenting to the council about how this work is unfolded. Obviously, it's something that we've been talking about since back in the fall of 2022 when we kicked off with the initial study. We've been working on this specific strategy portion since the fall of this year. So I'm going to turn it over to Charles Buki and Pete Lombardi. They're going to tell us a little bit about kind of how the work has unfolded throughout this phase of the particular project and what they're recommending, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. So we've got about 24 slides we'll go through. Pete will handle the first half, which will summarize the analysis we did about 18 months ago. I'll go through the second half, which will summarize the strategy you've got in your hands. And I think that we've got plenty of time to get through that and take questions at the end. But if there's at any moment any slides you want us to, you have questions at any moment in time, please do. Don't hold them till the end because it just might be very relevant right at the time, okay? So before we get started, I also do want to say the strategy work was a culmination of about six plus months work with a steering committee, a very impressive steering committee comprised of folks from City Hall, from the mayor's staff, from Michael Collins' staff, from the IDA, comprised of nonprofit developers, folks really from across the community. And it's a strategy we're very proud of, and that could not have become as sharp a strategy as it is without the work of that steering committee. On that steering committee also was Council President Hudson and Councilor Hogan, and so. Pardon me?
Councilor Rouser was on it.
Yes, excuse me. So we had really just 6 months of good, high-quality, interactive work with a very accomplished steering committee. So I do want to acknowledge that at the outset. So Pete, do you want to take the front half of the slides?
Yeah. Thank you, Charles and Michelle. So as Michelle mentioned, our team started working with the city of Syracuse actually in September of 2022 on the study portion of this work. That month, we started working with a series of working groups to inform the study, a working group from the affordable housing sector, from the market rate housing sector, from the neighborhood quality of life sector groups, housing advocates, all working to inform our work, along with a steering committee. And when that process began, we began collecting a lot of different data sets to inform the work, including working with city staff to set eyes on all 35,000 residential structures in the city. That was an important part of the data that we collected for the Syracuse housing study. And as this timeline shows, June of 2023 is really when that study came to a conclusion with some core findings and guidance for strategy development. And then October is when the strategy process launched. We had some public meetings back then in October, an open house in January. There's an open house tomorrow evening to present the draft housing strategy as we work to get feedback on this draft document. Next slide. And as I said, a key part of the work that wrapped up in June of last year was really some important guidance based on the findings from the Syracuse housing study. Next slide. So just before we get to the strategy draft, a few of the highlights from the Syracuse housing study that informed the strategy. One was really a recognition that the city of Syracuse's housing market is really a soft market within a soft regional market. It's clear to most folks that in the city of Syracuse, housing values, levels of investment are below values and levels of investment in the rest of Onondaga County. I think what a lot of people don't recognize as much, and we really saw this in our work, is that this is a region with a soft housing market. So that's really important for understanding the direction for a city housing strategy, is that you're in the context of a regional market that has experienced decades of soft demand and disinvestment, which has had a particularly severe impact on the city's housing supply. Next slide. And so in addition to that overall finding of a soft city market within a soft regional market, there were two important gaps that we really built the housing study around. One was recognition that Syracuse has a pretty significant market gap. What people with resources in this region are willing to pay for housing in the city of Syracuse is well below what it actually costs to build new high-quality housing in the city or to maintain the existing housing stock. The impact of that over decades is disinvestment and deferred maintenance that has been accumulating. This map on this slide here is a reflection of that windshield survey of all 35,000 residential properties, which found that about a third of the structures in the city show very visible signs of deferred maintenance and disinvestment. So that market gap has had an impact for decades in Syracuse, and it's an important finding from the housing study. Next slide. The other gap that the housing study points out is an affordability gap. What it takes to maintain a housing supply in good condition exceeds what most households in Syracuse are able to pay for housing on account of low incomes. We did some analysis that found that to take a typical existing apartment in the city of Syracuse and to catch up on deferred maintenance and then to maintain it in good condition going forward would require a rent of roughly $1,800 a month if there were no subsidies involved to catch up on deferred maintenance and then maintain it going forward. And $1,800 a month is a level that exceeds what most households in Syracuse can afford. So that's an important marker of what the affordability gap means for Syracuse. Next slide. And a really important feature of the housing study was really showing how the market gap and the affordability gap are in tension with each other. That any effort to reduce the market gap and make the housing supply in neighborhoods more desirable for households that have resources to pay for housing, any effort to improve the market gap has an impact to expand the affordability gap. If you're making the housing supply better condition, you're making neighborhoods more desirable, you're boosting costs, you're boosting rent, you're boosting housing prices, and that opens up the affordability gap. And the same is true vice versa. Focusing on the affordability gap risks widening the market gap in parts of the city. So it was an important conclusion of the housing study, was that these two gaps are really important and that they exist in tension with each other, and that to to move forward, to create a responsive strategy, you have to pay attention to both and recognize that they influence each other. Next slide. And so where we started out the strategy process was really recognizing that these two gaps exist and that combined they represent roughly $1 billion or more problem to solve. That's a big number. And we also recognize that the city doesn't really even have 10% of that figure to begin working on the problem. It's more realistic that the city would have between $10 and $25 million to work with over a multi-year period to work on both the market gap and the affordability gap. So an important place where the study handed off to the strategy was recognizing that the city can't do everything in all places, but that progress can be made by doing the right things in the right places. And that's where Charles will take off here with the strategy overview.
Right. So as I mentioned at the outset, we had worked with the steering committee really since last fall, and that the work involved pretty extensive consideration of the property conditions throughout the city. It involved a great consideration of the cost of making the improvements, the long overdue improvements Pete referenced, and the city's capacity, and I would underscore this piece, the city's capacity, inclusive of public and private sector alike, to pay those costs. So could you go back to the previous slide? So, you know, with a set of challenges, with a very, very high price tag, and with a capacity to pay for a fraction of that, really, we thinking very, very carefully about what to do where becomes paramount and was really constituted the core of the work in the strategy effort. Next slide, please. And next slide, thank you. So the way we really wrestled with it was, you know, super summarizing the study was that, as Pete had said, there's a market gap issue that is in tension with an affordability gap. The market gap is a function of decades of disinvestment, and the affordability gap is a function of very low incomes. So those three pieces really were always front and center as we began to look at the strategy. Next slide, come on, thank you. So the strategy really has three components to it. One, which is continue current work. So work downtown, right, now constituting nearly $1 billion worth of work over the last several decades. Resurgent Neighborhood Initiative, the Community Grid Vision Plan, the East Adams redevelopment effort, the land banking effort, code enforcement effort. These efforts need to continue, right? There may be some adjustments and some tweaks along the way, but that's the first building block of going forward. The second is that there should be new efforts in more challenged areas, right? With the objective of stabilizing those more challenged areas. Right? And the third is to invest new dollars in vulnerable middle areas of the city with the objective of revitalizing some of those middle areas that we begin to work in. Right? So that first point, let's take what this map begins to show. If you look at the crosshatched area, that's your downtown, right? So that's a significant geography, and it is to, you know, our recommendation is absolutely continue what you're doing there. Do not take the foot off the gas pedal at all. If you then begin to look at the gray area, you're now looking at the regrid work. You're looking at East Adams, the regrid work tied to the 81. That becomes absolutely essential to continue. And then if you go to your shaded blue area, you're now looking at East Adams redevelopment. So all that's if you look at that map for a while, that is a big area getting a lot of very thoughtful, concentrated reinvestment dollars. Those would continue. If you work outside of that and you begin to see two dots there, your yellow dots indicate significant code enforcement efforts, and your blue dots signify your land banking efforts. So you can see the significant amount of activity across a significant geography in the city, those should all continue. Where you see lighter touches on code enforcement and lighter touches by the land bank are going to begin to indicate areas that are vulnerable, right? But not really, really in trouble just yet. So it's the connection between continuing this ongoing work and beginning to think about additional work. Next slide. So what we did was we looked at the geography of the whole, and as you see here in the gray shaded area, that's the focused multi-billion-dollar work that's taking place now and that would continue. And we looked at a variety of conditions across the balance of the city, and that allowed us to divide the rest of the city into 3 chunks, right? Those areas shown in blue, which are somewhere between stable and healthy, those areas in yellow, which are very, very challenged, and those areas in purple, which we regard as having 2 signature qualities. They are vulnerable, but they are recoverable before they become distressed. Right? So next slide, please. So now it allowed us to then take, actually, let's go back to the previous slide. Come on, thank you. In the next slide we're going to see, we're going to take off the blue. So what you see here in blue, we're going to take that off, and we're going to take off the gray, just so we can focus on what remains, which is the middle and the really severely challenged sections of the city. All right, so let's pull that up. Yes, sure.
The purple is what?
Sorry?
The purple.
Purple. Purple is what we would consider to be your vulnerable middle markets, right? That are at risk of decline. It's the direction many of them are headed in without an intervention, right? Importantly, if you go back to, I think, one of the first comments Pete made, it's okay, come on, you don't, which is that this is a soft market in a soft region, right? What you see up there in purple, if you only are thinking about the city of Syracuse, it looks solidly middle, right? It can even look prosperous. But when you zoom out and look at the region, which has a lot of housing for very competitive prices, that purple becomes very, very vulnerable. And so you have to think of it in that context, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. So I mean, obviously, we're going to be in competition for a lot of people that are going to come to work here at Micron and all this. And this is sort of we're at a competitive disadvantage with the suburbs.
You're at a severe disadvantage with the
severe
suburbs
competitive
now.
disadvantage
Correct.
with the suburbs.
And you want it, and so your place, the geography to be able to compete quickly is that purple geography.
And if people move in, obviously, that raises, and they start spending money, private investments is incentivized to be in those neighborhoods.
That's your path to the tax base.
Right, and that, obviously, that ups the assessed value of the properties.
That's correct.
And then will provide more tax revenue for everybody.
That is correct.
Okay.
So next slide. So here, having removed, the stable to healthy from the map, you're just taking it off the board so it's easier to see, and taking downtown, East Adams, and the 81 work and regrid, off. What you see here really is the balance of the city divided into 2 chunks. And so we, looking at the conditions across the city, developed a nomenclature that those severely challenged areas we would label them legacy clusters. Those areas that are vulnerable in the middle would be asset clusters. Next slide, please. What we've recommended in the strategy is in your asset clusters here now shown. So now we've taken everything off the map except those areas that are the vulnerable middle. And this is where you've got, I think, really a golden opportunity as a city to reposition the city to compete, not just in the county, but across the region for households that might not otherwise and probably won't otherwise choose to live in the city. So you've got good housing stocks. They were well built to begin with. They have suffered from disinvestment, but because they were well built to begin with, there's a lot to work with there. The disinvestment has not tended to root, and our opportunity from a leverage ratio is significant. A further point to really, I think, internalize when we take a look at these asset areas is we believe that the data is really quite clear that there's actually private capital on the sidelines that would be more aggressively reinvested by homeowners, by rental property owners in those properties if it begins to make financial sense to do so. And so really pulling that private capital off the sidelines allows you to not have to spend only public money, but you're spending public money to drive private money. You can get a really big bang for your buck in these areas. Next slide. Your legacy areas are far more challenged. We've got a lot more vacant land to address. We've got a lot more instability that requires attention. The building conditions are in much rougher shape. They generally weren't built to the same standards to begin with. They were smaller, not as well built, and they've been disinvested in. So the disadvantages are significant. And so really thinking carefully about what to do here as differentiated from what to do in the asset areas becomes a critical part of the work ahead. Previous slide, come on. So here the work is really leveraging the incipient market strength, right? And grabbing, putting together the incentives for the private sector to be a full partner. Next slide. Here, the work is really to stabilize this and get it ready for the private market when that time comes. Okay.
And when does that time come?
So it's really going to be once you get a critical mass of control. The control cannot be too widely dispersed. It's got to be, in subsequent slides, I'll walk through some of that. But we think it's at least a decade of hard stabilization work.
So was the argument, you'd be saying instead of doing the one-off, when we take a land bank property, instead of bringing one house back to use, are you saying to hold on until we get whole blocks? Is that the...
I think it would have to be a case-by-case basis depending on the health of the particular block, right? So sometimes you'd want the land bank to move expeditiously, right? Put it back on the tax rolls if it makes perfect sense, right? For that block, that property, that block, that section of the city at that time. But I can imagine that there would be some times when a hold strategy might make more sense, but it would depend on the conditions on the block.
Well, we got an example down on Delaware and Grace Street where we've acquired a bunch of properties. Land banks acquired a bunch of properties on Kellogg Street and around
Right.
there. And then we'll work with Home Headquarters or one of those other agencies to create a neighborhood.
Yes.
So does that leave us a decade away from truly seeing deconcentration of poverty in those neighborhoods?
Again, and I don't...
And I know I'm being careful with that question, but I get a little queasy thinking
Sure.
that we're just going to suddenly up and walk away from neighborhoods and concentrate. And I get it, but
Sure. So the answer is it depends. So for instance, let's suppose you had let's take a couple of blocks in Elmwood just as an example, right? Or a couple of blocks in Brighton, just as an example. If you were proceeding 2-3 years down the path, and you are acquiring and beginning to stabilize, right? And a private market actor within their legal rights developed a piece of property, redeveloped a piece of property in a problematic way, right? But did so perfectly within their legal right, you could actually set the clock back. So they're going to be things that we don't have control over. But you would very much hope to upend that. And I'll, if I can I go to the next slide? Yeah. So here, the tendency very much in many cities is shown on the top left, okay? Which is with whatever resources we've got to transform as best we can properties we can get our hands on, right? Moving from the top left to the top right, in both the asset areas of the city and in the legacy areas of the city, a concerted effort is going to have to be, you're going to need a concerted effort to get a much greater degree of control end to end, what we call the whole block. Okay, now that doesn't mean that you have to own every single property, but you really need a pretty significant critical mass of properties. The way we like to think of it is, don't give yourself permission to do anything until you've actually got a strategy to do a lot end to end on a block.
If I can just jump in right there. So the handout that I just passed around shows, I think to the question kind of are we walking away from areas? The answer is no. So that's looking kind of citywide. Where have we been doing construction for new affordable housing development, both for owner occupants and for rental occupied properties? Where are we digging holes this year in 2024? And where do we have projects that we're expecting to have coming in the pipeline in 2025 and moving forward? And I think kind of where this whole area approach becomes really critical. I think if you think about kind of the Baker Woodland Garfield area, I think we've done a very effective job at concentrating new construction for areas where we had vacant land. We haven't necessarily yet had a strategy for some of the rental occupied properties that might be scattershot still in between there. And so what this is saying is kind of we're getting closer to what this is, but that there's still kind of a couple more steps that we need to take.
So you're talking, it's basically sort of a two-prong. You got an asset cluster and you have a legacy cluster. So you address a one legacy cluster neighborhood and then you address an asset cluster neighborhood, correct?
If you have the financial
If you
capacity to do that, that would certainly we would recommend
And
that.
of course, in some of those neighborhoods, there's only funding that's going to work for one neighborhood and might not work for another neighborhood, correct?
That's right. So each funding source will have its own constraints and rules, and you'll have to work with
The
those.
legacy cluster
Yes.
neighborhoods would have access to LIHTC funding and things like that more than the asset cluster.
Absolutely. Yeah. So those preconditions would actually, those constraints or rules that come with the funding.
So, how did you come to the conclusion? Did you walk these streets, like on the north side, lower north side, Cornwall? Did you actually walk these streets, or you just went through? Do you want to answer, Michelle?
Yeah, we surveyed all 33,000 residential structures in the city of Syracuse. So yes, there was a lot of walking.
Okay, so right now, as I look
2022.
at it, there's a lot of distress. And even this morning, I got more emails this morning as to why the north side is getting shortchanged. Why are we overlooked? And I got an answer from my constituents. Why is the north side overlooked? We got a lot of poverty on the north side. We have people walking into the streets. There's a lot of boarded up houses. I can tell you how much boarded up houses we have here. We have a lot of issues. We have tremendous issues. And since last week, because the newspaper article never mentioned the north side or Court Woodlawn, and people in the Court Woodlawn area, may I add, is also not the first, but also the 5th Council District as well. And we do have a lot of issues. And I got an email this morning from a constituent who said, why are we overlooked? Now, maybe you can explain why the north side is not considered a priority, but I can tell you, my friend, take you down to Lodi Street, take you all this Burnett Ave, Hiawatha, that's all my district. I can show where distress is. Levels of crime, levels of drugs. And I don't mean to overwhelm you, but maybe you can answer my questions. I chair the Dale Street Neighborhood Watch, and I mentioned it to you last week. Come to my meeting on Thursday, and I think you could answer the questions better than I can. That would be a great help if you come to my meeting on Thursday.
Councilor, if I may,
Yes.
Sharon Owens, Deputy Mayor. The NBD staff is planning on doing a lot of community meetings. I'll be out in community meetings. I think it's important to really emphasize that we are not stopping any work we've been doing in any of what's categorized as legacy neighborhoods. The resources that we have had, public resources, will continue to be, particularly on the north side. One of the issues that we have is around site control. Being able to do exactly what these folks are saying and cluster site control on the north side. You know more than anyone else that there are landlords who may not be the best landlords, but they pay their taxes because they hold on to those properties.
And there's those who have very good landlords who are getting short drifted because tenants have a lot of associated rights, but landlords, as you know, on the north side, don't have anybody to go through.
And I would not disagree with you, but that is an issue and a policy statewide that this housing strategy is not going to solve.
I don't think they're gonna, I know, I respectfully, I know they're not gonna solve it, but when people look at this and they say, why is the north side? And I know I was told it may be down the road in 4 years, but it's just hard for me.
What is important for us to help you all be able to talk to your constituents is that they are not being shortchanged and they are not being overlooked and they are not being ignored. Neither is the near west side. Neither is the south side. Neither is the other areas where legacy funding will continue to be implemented. What we are doing and what Charles and this team is talking about is trying to match what we have been doing right now, what Harry and his crew are doing fantastic work doing. What we have to have for your particular neighborhood is a strategy for site control. It is my hope, and I'm thankful to the council for approval of the land trust initiative we go through, that in working with Caitlin for tax exempt, we can proactively begin to go after properties that need to be part of a larger block development. Right now, we wait for people to be tax exempt. That doesn't work for us. So a housing strategy, a housing trust fund, the land bank, partners like Harry and Home Headquarters pulls together more tools for us, particularly in your neighborhood, to be proactive for properties that we can't wait for somebody to decide not to pay the taxes. And then when we come after them, then they pay them. And that's what goes on, particularly in your neighborhood, quite a bit.
I mean, the message has got to get out there. You have more facts than I do as a council. You have a lot of facts.
It is our job to make sure that we get out there and give people the whole
Absolutely,
story.
and I can only do so much for my constituents, because what I hear. Okay, I'm not looking for any other
Yes, sir.
issues, but I'm trying to educate them. But I think it's important, though, that the administration really is out there and explaining, so this wave and this wave. And so when the article appears, people look, oh, Court Woodlawn is not mentioned, Northside isn't mentioned. If they can emphasize more what the projects are, what the reasoning are, that helps. That will help getting the word out for constituents, because they're those who just going to make the assumptions.
We started on the north side.
I know. We got to get the word out. I
Yep.
agree with you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
I have a question. So, I see that Upper East Side, of Syracuse in Tip Hill area. I know we surveyed far as like the housing stock, but how is that gonna be relatable to the people that's in the house, right?
Yeah.
So those connections, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, so the recommendations that we're putting forward for the sequencing of the first 4 waves, no matter what those 4 waves end up being, obviously we're recommending that we're starting in Salt Springs and Tip Hill for the first wave, and that the second wave, Eastwood and Elmwood, but irrespective of specific geographies, we'll be carrying out a small area planning process throughout the second half of 2024 for the first 4 waves selected. That's going to be where we're going to be doing a lot of additional kind of qualitative outreach to residents that are in those neighborhoods, with the goal of kind of understanding. Certainly there's a number of programs that we already have in place, great partnerships through organizations like Home Headquarters. So some of those program streams, depending on what the circumstances are for the residents on a given block, some of those programs will fit their needs. In some cases, we know that those existing programs that we have are not going to fit the needs. So we want to make sure before we're going out and saying kind of, here's exactly what the program is, here's what the requirements are going to be, we want to make sure we understand kind of what are the gaps that we need to close so that we can really work effectively in this whole block manner, and then design a program that fits those needs.
Because that's my concern. I think,
Yep.
I mean, this is all amazing that we're working on trying to build a community. We have wonderful organizations that are doing a great job. It just seems like we're going backwards. We need to know, like now we're going to go to the neighborhood to figure out who's living in there when we should already know? Because now we're, you know what I mean?
There's a lot of data that we have actually about kind of who, like what the makeup is kind of from a home ownership standpoint. There's a ton of information that we have, but we don't necessarily know the things like kind of what's your goal for your property? Are you thinking about, did you just buy it? We might know that you just bought it, but are you thinking about upgrading it? Are you thinking about kind of just like what's your life situation? So that's the kind of stuff like person to person that we need to understand outside of just the hard data that we have available to us and that we've looked at very in depth throughout the last 18 months.
Well,
over
those
both the
neighborhoods,
study, yeah.
Michelle, are typically people that's been there forever. Typically the east side, right? That east side, South Spring, those are neighborhoods with Carrier, Chrysler, Crucible, GM. Those families have been there for 20 or 30 years. So they're sort of like the / middle class and area. So I'm just as far as funding and support, they don't qualify for any of the other.
And that's kind of the idea with this is we acknowledge that that's a really critical missing piece that we have. And so in order for this to be successful, we know we're going to have to figure out a way to identify new programs that will align with those folks' needs. The challenge that we have is that the federal and state resources that we use do not recognize those needs as being allowable in a lot of cases. And so that's kind of the role, where the role of the Housing Trust Fund comes into play. By putting local resources, unrestricted resources, we will be able to kind of close those gaps. Because you're exactly right, it's a huge challenge, and until we figure out a way to work and meet those needs, we are not going to be successful in being able to kind of work in this concentrated manner.
So in other words, I mean, obviously in some of these neighborhoods, you'd be able to offer low-interest loans, much like the Syracuse Neighborhood Initiative that the mayor's father actually brought back to the
Yep.
city. And when you do that, when you improve those properties, obviously they raise in value, their assessed value raises, and it prepares maybe those properties, senior citizens, to move out and give it and
Yeah.
sell them to a younger family.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
So
another,
wow.
to your point, kind of the longtime homeowners, something that we run into quite a bit. We want to make sure that there's a chain of title, that kind of homeownership is able to become an asset and a vehicle for economic opportunity for their families. We don't want to see situations when those properties go into the hands of the tax foreclosure process. They become very complicated if there isn't a good title chain to it. So those are all the things we want to make sure that we're being really proactive about.
So I've got more questions than we probably have time for here today. But I'll focus on two that are completely, distinct and separate from each other, but things that I think might be important to talk about. The first has to do with the choice of neighborhood. And I understand the legacy versus asset paradigm. I understand that, the missing middle is something that we have to address as a city. But when I look within the asset cluster list, I look at Tip Hill, roughly 50-50 in terms of red and green, right? And so basically, I view a continuum running from most vulnerable to least vulnerable within the asset cluster. So why are we not focusing on the more vulnerable neighborhoods within the asset cluster rather than, Salt Springs in the middle of the pack for wave 1, far west side Tip Hills towards the bottom, wave 2, Eastwood 2 is, there's a whole lot of green on that, whereas Eastwood 1 is the most vulnerable within that higher cluster. And so how did that decision-making play itself out?
Sure. So there was a combination of factors that went into that. A lot of it came out of the results of the steering committee conversations that were happening for the last 6 months. I do think, to your point, 2 of the asset neighborhoods that we're prioritizing for the first waves are both in the bottom tier of the assets. So they're in the middle of about as middle of the pack as we can get. So we're not focusing on the strongest ones. I think there's an important balance that we have to strike of being both smart and fair. And we know that those neighborhoods have a lot of housing conditions that are very challenging. The East Side is a great example of, there's been many, many council meetings that I can count where I've gotten questions about what are we doing on the East Side, what are we doing on the East Side? And the answer has been, it's a challenging area, that the needs there do not fit the same tools that we have, that we've been overly reliant on. And so that was kind of where some of the role of being able to prioritize them as a part of this strategy came into play. I think other things, though, that were very important for us is thinking about where are assets that we can build on, where do we have strong commercial corridors, where do we have strong existing infrastructure from a resident standpoint, neighborhood association standpoint, where do we know that we're going to be doing a lot of significant work that's in the pipeline that we can build and leverage? Where have we been successful? Where can we see that there's data to indicate that we're likely to be successful? Those are all things that went into kind of the sequencing recommendations.
And second goes back to the kind of fundamental conditions of the city with the market gap and the affordability gap. If we go all in on the market gap, it exacerbates the affordability gap and vice versa. In terms of the strategy that we're putting forth, where are we in terms of that ratio or balance between one or the other?
So I think the thought of why we were starting with two kind of middle tier towards the bottom of the asset group in terms of strength. We know that there's a role of which we need to be able to have some quick wins right out of the gate. And kind of we need to be cognizant and acknowledging of the resources. We have a finite amount of resources to work with. And so kind of based on what the collective of conditions are in those neighborhoods, we think that being able to start within those areas help achieve that balance. I think a really important thing for us to keep in mind is that no matter what neighborhood kind of conditions we're working in, making sure that we're aligning programs where we're doing upgrades to rental properties contingent upon maintaining affordable rents for people. That is of a top priority for us. So hedging against displacement in all neighborhoods is something that we're looking to be really intentional about with this. So I think that we're understanding that this is a really challenging thing to kind of think about how we move forward with this. I think that thanks to the work through the steering committee, I think that we're aligned about as best as we probably can be.
Well, of course, I have a lot to say, but I can hold some of it back. I think that this is a huge plan that definitely encompasses a lot, but doesn't include a lot of our concerns, some concerned neighborhoods, I should say. However, we do represent the full city. I represent the South Side, which is one of the main distressed communities. In the North Side, I've walked the North Side for lead initiatives, and the homes that I've seen on the North Side that people live in are very, very scary. I thought they were abandoned. So certain areas of the North Side that are not included in this, I mean, and if it's because of site control or whatever, I just think that it needs to be addressed. And the current route of possible LIHTC property development is not really the route that needs to happen in some of these legacy neighborhoods. If the neighborhoods have already been distressed, the LIHTC properties are just continuing to do the same. It's just adding the same layer onto what's already there. So that's something separate from this, but we need to look at that and figure out if it's a zoning issue with how rezone was created. We need to look at those things. And yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that was said here, but we need to look at this further. It needs to be.
So if I could jump in for just a minute. So Michael Collins, Commissioner of Neighborhood and Business Development. To your point, Councilor, one of the things that I think is incredibly important to take away is that this study is or this strategy, it's an additive strategy. And it is in recognizing the fact that we do not have $1.5 to $2.5 billion to be able to address everything. It is extremely difficult for us to be patient to be able to make sure that we can get to all of the properties that we need to get to. So I really appreciate you raising the point. This is, as we've heard a few times, this is not we are not paying attention to certain neighborhoods. We are continuing exactly what we've been doing all along, and that does include, to your point, work around enforcement related to lead. And it does mean that we're going to continue to utilize the resources such as the land bank and the tools that are out there. But since you all authorized the creation of the Housing Trust Fund, the more money we are able to raise to put into that, the more we're able to do to be able to be effective in these neighborhoods in a way that allows us to then move on to additional neighborhoods to be able to do, while continuing to use the funds that are out there and advocating with the state to make the current funds that are available more flexible. So is this the end all be all? Absolutely not. Is it an absolutely aggressive step forward, learning from and recognizing everything that we've done over the past 30 years? Absolutely. What we're doing right here is we are making sure that we are taking the best learning that we've got, understanding the resources, adding to the resources that we've got, and then how are we making the most for this so we can address the homes, but also we can address our tax value. As you all are considering the budget, I know you've got a deep appreciation for what that means. So this isn't going to answer every single neighborhood in any immediate fashion, and that's our challenge. That is absolutely our challenge in front of us, is how do we understand and then turn around and help our neighbors come along to say, since we can't address everything, is this the right way to move forward to address what we can now, and so we can build on what we've done and have a stronger base and a stronger foundation for us to build on as we're going
So,
forward.
Michael, in order for this to work, and just, I guess, comment on this, we have got to get aggressive with the bad actors, right? I mean, the landlords that are letting these they're sucking every last dollar out of them, letting them fall apart. How aggressive do we get? Because it seems to me like we have to get very aggressive.
So, I agree with you, and I think that's where you take a look at, when we talk about the fact that we're not starting from zero, we've got a strong base. The fact that we used receivership for the first time with the green properties. That's now a new tool in our toolbox. The fact that we created the emergency repair program. And as Deputy Mayor talked about and the team has talked about within the report, how do we adjust what we asked the land bank to be able to do, and perhaps use some of the funding from the Housing Trust Fund and other sources to be able to acquire property, so that we've got a variety of different ways to be able to make sure that whether it's code enforcement, whether it's going to the courts, whether it's acquisition, we have a way to make sure that the people that live in that house and the neighbors of that apartment building are not suffering.
I think to what Sharon said, one second, Pat, to what Sharon said and what the other councilors have been saying, I think the neighbors understand this better when they see that we are actually going after the houses that are the problems on those blocks. I can drive you right now to 50 different blocks where the neighbors that have been there for 40, 50 years are saying, if you get rid of that landlord, suddenly things start to at least feel better.
And you know what, Counselor, that's true. But unfortunately, that's a process that's really difficult sometimes. And I have to commend this particular administration for going after some of these bad actors, like probably the first time in 20 years. I mean, where we're threatening. But even more important than going after the bad actors is to incentivize people to invest in our neighborhoods. That's it. Where somebody thinks he can make some money by investing in some of these working class neighborhoods, we should be all on board about that. That's the big thing.
So Councilor, we've always, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Mike.
So to both your points, what we've had to date has been a stick. We are now looking to also put out there an incentive as well.
So in these twofold questions that you guys could probably answer. In this neighborhood, there's not a lot of rental properties in these neighborhoods first, right?
So, no, actually, there are quite a bit.
There's quite a bit, like,
Yeah.
there's several. In the neighborhood that we're going into, and the
Tipperary
outside-
Hills, probably
Yes.
60%, 65%
Yes.
rental.
And then now the second thing is in Tipperary Hill, right?
Yeah.
In the area. Now the second part is, how are you going to get the people that own the homes to buy into what you're saying? Because I received several calls like, okay, the city's coming in, they want to be a part of it because, next there's a plan, right? They're going to come in, they're going to revitalize, they're going to go up on our taxes, they want to be a part. How do we change that narrative? How do you get people to think that, or get them to understand that you're coming in with the support and not to try to you know?
Sure. So I think that that's where kind of the role of doing a lot of the small area planning and that outreach, really intentional kind of person to person, getting out, meeting homeowners and making sure they kind of understand what the opportunities are that are available to them. I think we want to be able to use the incentive approach as much as absolutely possible. And I think that kind of based on the metrics that we're looking to achieve within the neighborhoods, I think that we're well positioned to be able to be successful by offering kind of some specific program types of incentives, certainly to the questions kind of around the need for really additional aggressive code enforcement. When the conditions are right, that needs to be a tool that we can use. That is also kind of the stick approach that can happen in certain neighborhoods. But the goal is that we're, like I said, kind of working and designing programs in a way where people want to be a part of it. So that we can kind of get around that. But
I think, obviously, when Syracuse Neighborhood Initiative, I see Carrie here, you know, how successful was that as far as people wanting to go there and getting, you know, for low-interest loans and everything else to upgrade their properties?
But that's private, and we're talking about
Well, that's
city.
what we're talking. We're talking
Yeah.
about creating a public fund that isn't hampered by any kind of rules and regulations.
If I may, I do want to turn it back over to Charles. I know there's a handful of questions that have kind of come up around some of the more kind of policy design sorts of things. So I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about those just a little bit.
Actually, one slide back. I'm going to go toggle between these two slides and just go back and forth between strategy and tactics for a second and use it to make a comment on policy. So your comment on bad actors is a really important comment. And Michael's comments on, you know, we have tools that might be described in the category of sticks. Now, it's some carrots as well, okay? Whether it's bad actors, whether it's carrots and sticks at the tactical level, okay? What you don't want to do is you don't want to put this bad actor out, and this bad actor out, and this bad actor out, okay? You only have the resources to put 3 bad actors out of service. You want them to be right together in a tight cluster. Get the impact. Remember the earlier slide where you've got a problem that costs this much, right? Whether it's dollars or man hours or whatever it is, but you've only got this much to spend. The tendency is to take this, right, and spot a little in Brighton and a little bit in the north side and a little bit here and a little bit there, and none of it actually works until it's concentrated. Right? So I wish that I could stand here and tell you that a little sprinkled everywhere is going to get you where you want to get, and it's not going to work. Right? What you've got to do is recognize the opportunity costs, whether it's carrots, whether it's sticks, whatever you want to do, pack it in tightly here, and then pack it not just in here, here, and here, but on this side of the ledger, so that it's this whole block and this whole area. That's how you get a concentrated impact, and that's the only way to stretch $20, $30, $40 million into actually making progress against a 900 million, billion one problem. A. B, next slide. Your policy ambitions have always got to be deconcentrate poverty, cultivate confidence in the market, and strengthen the city's fiscal position. If an activity is not doing these things, you should question it.
Well, I can't imagine that we're funding the land bank adequately to be able to hold property in the way we need to.
The land bank needs a lot more resources. It's got brilliant leadership. It's got the right charter. It needs more resources to do all the things it can do.
Because to get those 3 in that cluster is not going to happen on day one.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Well, I was going to say the same thing, that we need to focus more dollars towards the land bank, towards our home-based housing entities versus LIHTC that a lot of out-of-state and out-of-town developers are. I mean, even need to seek it, but they know our communities versus others that don't know our communities and tend to push the wrong things.
I agree with that. Home headquarters has a huge project before them just this year, and they are absolutely able to get it done. We have to be able to use all of our existing partners to do this.
Yes.
And we all know that Home Headquarters just doesn't build. They are the largest lender to homeowners in our entire region. So really using them for that purpose that Michelle talked about for these existing homeowners who need some assistance. But we also have got to look at what other entities that may not be public but it may be private, and depending on what they're talking about, we have to be able to look at that. That is where discussions about what we've done traditionally and what we need to do different come into play. And those are hard discussions to have.
And to argue, I mean, to add to that home headquarters thing, I think without them, what are we doing to teach people about generational wealth? Because
Exactly.
they're the only ones that are doing it in a real
And there was a
fashion.
comment made that I just have to add this, and I know we're running out of time, but also there has been a generational wealth and asset protection with trust workshop that just happened. There's another one coming up in a couple of weeks. We are doubling down on that conversation. While we love the land bank and what they do, if Miss Smith's children and they can keep their property by a living will, we should teach them how to do that.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Unfortunately, we're probably going to have another meeting on this. No, actually, fortunately, because obviously there's a lot of misinformation out there. Everybody's a headline reader now, and so they get things a little mixed up. But I just want to thank everybody. I just wanted to ask one question. I saw in here, and maybe I wasn't aware, but the special purpose vehicle, is that a different entity we're talking about?
No, I think the idea that the Housing Trust Fund could serve
It's
as
the
that
same
special
thing.
purpose entity, yeah. So basically, we need a vehicle that is able to move money in a way that is flexible and get money out to get the work
It
implemented.
should be against
So
the rules to name an entity two different government names. Was that your idea? Charles, okay. We'll blame Charles.
What is the timeline for rollout and implementation if the plan's accepted?
Sure. So the idea is that for the first 4 cluster areas, we would be moving forward with the small area process that I mentioned earlier for the next 6 months, kind of closing out the end of the 2024 calendar year. Beginning early 2025, we would want to be hitting the ground running with implementation in the first wave areas. And then the idea is that we would be moving forward, launching new waves of work within the first, basically every 2 years thereafter.
But within the upcoming budget cycle, the 25 fiscal year.
Yep, yeah, during the 24-25 fiscal year.
Counselor, I think we're going to have another meeting on this, and we have the school district and their entire staff that's going to fill City Hall here, so we're going to have to end this meeting. I want to thank Deputy Commissioner here, Charles and Pete, and everybody else, and we'll have another meeting on this. So I'm going to adjourn now. Motion to adjourn. Second?
Second.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Okay. We got the school district coming in. Is it okay if I ended it? I got so many more questions.